The flames had only left her with memories, and a marriage bed turned to char when Rosalind Lockhart found herself kneeling in the ashes of what was once her home, her trembling fingers sifting through the remnants of her former life. The bitter Montana winter of 1878 showed no mercy as the wind whipped across the open plain, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke that still clung to the blackened timbers. The fire had claimed everything in a single night: her cabin, her possessions, and whatever future she had imagined with Thomas before the fever took him 3 months prior. At 24, she was alone on the edge of civilization with nothing but the clothes on her back and the wedding band that seemed to weigh heavier on her finger with each passing day. "There ain't much worth saving, madam," said Mr. Peterson, the elderly neighbor who had ridden over when he saw the smoke rising above the trees yesterday. He stood awkwardly at what used to be her front porch, hat in hand. "You're welcome to stay with Martha and me until spring." Rosalind shook her head, her auburn hair falling loose from its pins. "You're kind to offer, but I couldn't impose." The Petersons had little enough for themselves, and their cabin was barely large enough for the two of them and their grandchildren who visited occasionally. "You can't stay here, Mrs. Lockhart. There's nothing left." "I have the root cellar," she said, gesturing to the small door in the ground several yards away that remained untouched by the flames. "And the barn only lost one wall. I can make do until I decide what comes next." Mr. Peterson frowned, but knew better than to argue with the stubborn widow. Thomas Lockhart had often joked that his wife had enough determination for 3 people. "At least let me bring you some supplies before the snow sets in." "Thank you," she conceded, knowing that pride would not keep her warm or fed. After Mr. Peterson left, promising to return the next day, Rosalind stared at the ruins of her home. She and Thomas had built it with their own hands after they married and journeyed west from Boston. They had dreams of children running through the meadow, of growing old together watching the sunset over the mountains. Now those dreams were as scattered as the ashes beneath her feet. The first night in the barn was the hardest. She had managed to salvage a few blankets from the storage chest in the root cellar, but the wind found every crack in the damaged wall, and the temperature dropped well below freezing by midnight. Huddled in the straw, Rosalind wondered if she would survive until morning. When dawn broke, she was still alive, though her lips were blue and her fingers numb. She forced herself to move, to check on the 2 chickens that had somehow survived in their coop behind the barn, and to assess what remained of her world in the harsh light of day. The situation was dire. The barn would not provide adequate shelter through the Montana winter, and the root cellar, while intact, was too small and damp for habitation. She had no money to rebuild, no family to turn to, and pride prevented her from becoming a burden on the community that had their own struggles against the unforgiving frontier. As she stood contemplating her limited options, the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. A rider approached from the direction of town, his figure growing larger against the backdrop of the snow-covered mountains. Rosalind straightened her back and tucked her hair behind her ears, unwilling to appear as desperate as she felt. The stranger rode a chestnut gelding and led a second horse pulling a small wagon loaded with lumber. His broad shoulders were dusted with snow, and his face was partially obscured by a thick scarf wrapped around his neck and the brim of his hat pulled low against the cold. "Mrs. Lockhart." He called out, stopping a respectful distance away. "Yes," she answered cautiously, one hand moving to the pocket of her skirt where she kept a small knife. Strangers could mean trouble for a woman alone. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "Xavier Evans," he introduced himself, removing his hat to reveal dark hair and eyes the color of the summer sky. "I work at the Rocking H Ranch about 10 miles west. Mr. Peterson stopped by last night and mentioned your situation." Rosalind felt a flicker of irritation at the old man's interference but pushed it aside. "Mr. Peterson is concerned, but I assure you, I am quite capable of managing on my own." Xavier Evans looked pointedly at the destroyed cabin and the damaged barn, then back at her with a raised eyebrow. "Madam, with all due respect, nobody can manage against a Montana winter without proper shelter, not even the most capable person alive." His directness should have offended her, but instead, Rosalind found herself fighting back a smile. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her as an equal rather than a fragile widow to be pitied. "I've brought some lumber to shore up that barn wall," he continued, nodding toward his wagon. "And there's food, blankets, and firewood. The ranch owner, Mr. Hollister, sends his regards and says to tell you there's a position at the ranch if you want it. They need someone to help with the cooking now that Mrs. Hollister is expecting." Rosalind shook her head. "I appreciate the offer, but this is my home. Thomas and we built it together. I can't just abandon it." Xavier studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "No one's asking you to abandon anything permanently, madam, but surviving comes first, rebuilding comes later." There was wisdom in his words, but the thought of leaving the land where she had been happiest with Thomas felt like a betrayal. "I'll accept your help with the barn," she finally said, "but I'm staying here." If Xavier was frustrated by her stubbornness, he didn't show it. Instead, he simply nodded and began unloading the lumber from his wagon. "Then we'd best get started before the next storm hits." For the next several hours, they worked side by side, reinforcing the damaged wall of the barn. Rosalind was surprised by how easily they fell into a rhythm, with Xavier never treating her as if she was incapable or in the way. He asked for her help when he needed it and respected her suggestions about the best way to secure the structure. By mid-afternoon, the wall was sturdy enough to keep out the worst of the wind, and Xavier had constructed a small stone fireplace in one corner of the barn using rocks from the collapsed chimney of her cabin. The physical labor had warmed them both, but as the sun began its early winter descent, the temperature dropped rapidly. "That should hold for now," Xavier said, stepping back to admire their work. "But it's still no place for a person to live through winter." Rosalind sighed, knowing he was right but unwilling to concede. "I've faced worse." "Have you?" he challenged, his blue eyes suddenly intense. "Have you faced a winter alone in a half-repaired barn with limited supplies and no help within miles if something goes wrong?" She hadn't, and they both knew it. Before she could respond, Xavier continued more gently, "At least come back to the ranch until spring. You can return when the weather breaks and rebuild properly." The offer was tempting, but Rosalind shook her head. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Evans, but my decision is made." Xavier looked like he wanted to argue further, but instead nodded reluctantly. "Then I'll be back tomorrow with more supplies, and I'll check on you regularly." It wasn't a request, and Rosalind found herself grateful for his determination even as she bristled at the implication that she needed looking after. "That won't be necessary." "Necessary or not, I'll be here," he said firmly, gathering his tools. "And Mrs. Lockhart? My friends call me Xav." With that, he mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode away, leaving Rosalind standing in the doorway of the reinforced barn, watching until he disappeared over the ridge. That night, with the new wall holding strong against the wind and a small fire crackling in the improvised fireplace, Rosalind slept better than she had since the night of the fire. She dreamed of Thomas, of his gentle smile and the way he used to tell her that she was the strongest woman he'd ever known. In the dream, he was healthy and whole, standing in a field of wildflowers, telling her it was all right to keep living, to find happiness again. She woke with tears on her cheeks, but a curious lightness in her heart that she hadn't felt in months. True to his word, Xavier returned the next day, and the day after that. Each time he brought more supplies, food, firewood, tools, and materials to further reinforce the barn. He never stayed longer than necessary to complete the day's work, but Rosalind found herself looking forward to his visits, to their conversations as they worked side by side. She learned that he was 28, had come west from Missouri after the war and had been working at the Rocking H Ranch for nearly 5 years. He spoke little of his past before that, and Rosalind didn't press. Everyone who came west had something they were leaving behind. A week after the fire, a heavy snowstorm descended upon the valley. Rosalind woke to find drifts piled against the barn door, and the world outside transformed into a white wasteland. The wind howled like a wounded animal, finding every crack and crevice in the hastily repaired barn wall. She had enough firewood for a few days, thanks to Xavier, and food to last perhaps a week if she was careful. But as the storm continued through the day and into the night with no sign of abating, Rosalind began to worry. Not for herself, she had survived loss and hardship before, but strangely, for Xavier. The thought of him attempting to reach her in such conditions filled her with dread. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it broke, Rosalind's firewood was dangerously low, and she had taken to wrapping herself in every blanket she possessed just to keep warm. The snow was piled so high that she had to dig her way out of the barn door, a task that left her exhausted and shivering. She was attempting to clear a path to the chicken coop when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats, muffled by the snow. Looking up, she saw Xavier approaching, his horse struggling through the deep drifts. "You're alive," he called out as soon as he was within earshot, relief evident in his voice. "Of course I am," she replied, though her hands were blue with cold and her legs trembled with fatigue. "Did you expect otherwise?" Xavier dismounted and trudged through the snow toward her, his expression a mixture of exasperation and admiration. "I expected to find you huddled by a dying fire, too proud to admit you were freezing to death. Well, as you can see, I'm perfectly fine." The lie was obvious even to her own ears as her teeth chattered between words. Xavier's gaze softened. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Rosalind Lockhart." It was the first time he had used her first name, and something about the way it sounded in his deep voice made her heart skip a beat. Before she could respond, he continued, "The ranch is snowed in too, but we have solid walls, a proper fireplace, and enough food and firewood to last the winter. Please come back with me, just until the worst of the winter passes." Rosalind looked around at the snow-covered landscape, at the damaged barn that was her only shelter, and at the pile of ashes where her home had once stood. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. Staying here alone was not brave or determined, it was foolish. "All right," she said quietly, "but just until spring." The relief on Xavier's face was immediate. "Just until spring," he agreed, though something in his eyes suggested he hoped she might change her mind. It took them the better part of the day to pack what few possessions Rosalind wished to bring and to make arrangements for her chickens. Mr. Peterson had managed to make his way over after the storm and agreed to take the birds until she returned. By late afternoon, they were on their way to the Rocking H Ranch, with Rosalind riding beside Xavier on his spare horse. The journey was slow through the deep snow, and darkness had fallen by the time they reached the ranch. Lights glowed warmly from the windows of the main house and the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. As they approached, the front door of the house opened, spilling golden light onto the snow, and a tall man with silver-streaked hair stepped out onto the porch. "That'll be Mr. Hollister," Xavier explained. "He and his wife are good people. You'll be comfortable here." Rosalind nodded, suddenly nervous. It had been a long time since she had to rely on the hospitality of strangers, and longer still since she had lived among others after the solitude of her homestead with Thomas. Mr. Hollister welcomed her with genuine warmth, as did his wife, Eleanor, a gentle woman whose pregnancy was just beginning to show. They showed Rosalind to a small but comfortable room in the main house, assuring her that she was welcome to stay as long as needed. "Xavier tells me you're quite capable around a homestead," Mr. Hollister said over supper that evening. "We could use an extra pair of hands, especially with Eleanor in her condition. There's pay, of course, and you'd have your meals and lodging here." Rosalind glanced at Xavier, who was focused intently on his plate. "I'm grateful for the offer," she said carefully, "but I intend to return to my land in the spring. My husband and we built that place together." "Of course," Alina Hollister said kindly. "But until then, we'd be honored if you'd consider staying on and helping. The men do the outdoor work, but running a house this size is becoming difficult for me alone." It was a fair arrangement, and Rosalind found herself nodding. "I would be happy to help in any way I can." Life at the Rocking H settled into a rhythm. Rosalind helped Alina with the cooking, cleaning, and mending, tasks that kept her busy from dawn until dusk. The work was harder than what she had been used to on her own small homestead, but there was comfort in the routine and in being part of a household again. She saw Xavier daily, though their interactions were limited. He worked from sunup to sundown with the other ranch hands, and their paths crossed primarily at mealtimes, when everyone gathered around the long table in the main house. Sometimes she would catch him watching her across the room, his expression thoughtful, but he made no special effort to seek her out. As January gave way to February, the worst of the winter settled over the valley. Temperatures dropped so low that the ranch hands took turns staying up through the night to keep the fires burning, lest anyone freeze in their sleep. During one particularly brutal cold snap, two of the newer hands who had been caught outside too long developed frostbite, and Rosalind spent several days helping Alina tend to them. It was during this time that she began to notice a change in the way the ranch hands treated Xavier. Though he wasn't the foreman, that position belonged to a grizzled older man named Curtis. The others seemed to defer to him, seeking his advice and following his lead without question. "Xavier has a way about him," Alina explained when Rosalind commented on it one evening as they prepared supper. "He doesn't say much, but when he does speak, people listen. Mr. Hollister says he's never met a man with better judgment or a steadier hand in a crisis." "He seems very capable," Rosalind agreed, trying to sound casual. Alina gave her a knowing look. "He's also unmarried and owns a good piece of land a few miles from here that he's been building on whenever he has time. Edward says he's nearly finished a fine house." Rosalind felt her cheeks warm. "I wasn't asking about his personal affairs, Mrs. Hollister." "Of course not," Alina replied with a small smile. "And please call me Alina. After all, we've been living under the same roof for over a month now." That evening at supper, Rosalind found herself studying Xavier more closely. He sat among the ranch hands, quiet but alert, occasionally joining in their conversation with a wry comment that would send the table into laughter. There was a quiet confidence about him that she hadn't fully appreciated before, a steadiness that reminded her a little of Thomas, though in other ways the two men couldn't have been more different. Thomas had been scholarly and gentle, a man who preferred books to horses, and had come west more for Rosalind's sense of adventure than his own. Xavier was a man shaped by the frontier, with calloused hands and eyes that missed nothing, a man who seemed as natural in this harsh landscape as the mountains themselves. After the meal, as Rosalind cleared the dishes, Xavier approached her. "Mrs. Lockhart, I'm riding out to check your property tomorrow. Is there anything specific you'd like me to look for?" Rosalind was surprised. "You've been checking on my property?" Xavier nodded. "Every couple of weeks when the weather allows. I make sure the barn is still standing and that nothing's been disturbed." The thought that he had been keeping watch over her homestead without being asked touched Rosalind deeply. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's very kind of you." "It's no trouble," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "I know how much that place means to you." There was something in his gaze that made Rosalind's heart beat faster, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth nearby. For a moment, neither of them spoke, caught in a silent connection that felt both new and somehow familiar. "I'd like to go with you," she said suddenly. "To check on the property." Xavier frowned. "The weather's still harsh and the trail will be difficult." "I'm not afraid of difficult," Rosalind countered, "and I'd like to see it for myself." After a moment's consideration, Xavier nodded. All right. We'll leave at first light. Dress warmly. The ride to Rosalind's homestead the next day was grueling. Though the sky was clear, the temperature remained well below freezing and the snow was deep in places, forcing them to proceed slowly. They spoke little during the journey, both focused on enduring the cold and navigating the challenging terrain. When they finally crested the ridge that overlooked her property, Rosalind felt a mixture of emotions wash over her. The charred remains of her cabin were almost completely covered in snow, with just the blackened chimney still visible above the white blanket. The barn stood as they had left it, sturdy enough to withstand the winter storms so far. But what struck her most was how small and isolated it all looked from this vantage point. In the vast expanse of snow-covered wilderness, the remnants of her life with Thomas seemed fragile and temporary, a brief human endeavor in a landscape that would endure long after they were gone. "Are you all right?" Xavier asked quietly, bringing his horse alongside hers. Rosalind nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She had expected to feel a desperate longing to return, to rebuild, to reclaim what she had lost. Instead, she felt a curious sense of closure, as if seeing the property this way allowed her to finally acknowledge that the life she had shared with Thomas was truly over. They rode down to inspect the barn and what remained of the cabin, confirming that everything was as it should be. The root cellar was still intact beneath its blanket of snow, and Xavier helped her clear the door so she could check that the preserved food she had stored there was still secure. As they prepared to leave, Rosalind took one last look around. "It's strange," she said. "For months after Thomas died, this land was all that kept me going. The thought that as long as I was here, working the soil we had worked together, some part of him lived on." She brushed snow from her gloves. "But now I realize that holding on to this place won't bring him back. And perhaps it's not what he would have wanted for me, to live alone out here, clinging to memories." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "What do you think he would have wanted for you?" The question was asked so gently that Rosalind found herself answering with complete honesty. "To be happy. To live fully," she smiled sadly. "Thomas always said I was too stubborn for my own good, that I needed to learn when to stand firm and when to let go." "Wise man," Xavier commented, a hint of humor in his voice. Rosalind laughed, the sound bright in the cold air. "He was. And he would be the first to tell me that rebuilding here alone would be foolish when there are other options." "Other options?" Xavier repeated, something careful in his tone. "Mr. Hollister mentioned that the ranch could use a permanent housekeeper and cook, especially once the baby arrives." Rosalind hesitated. "I'm considering his offer." If Xavier was pleased by this news, he didn't show it. Instead, he simply nodded. "It's a good position. The Hollisters are fair employers, and you'd be comfortable there." "Yes," Rosalind agreed, feeling a twinge of disappointment at his neutral response. "It makes practical sense." They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, casting long shadows across the snow and painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. As they approached the stables, Xavier finally spoke. "Rosalind," he said, the use of her first name still rare enough to catch her attention. "I'm glad you're considering staying." Before she could respond, he had dismounted and was leading both horses into the stable, leaving Rosalind to wonder at the emotion she had glimpsed in his eyes before he turned away. The next few weeks brought a gradual thaw, both in the weather and in Rosalind's relationship with Xavier. Though their daily routines remained largely separate, she began to notice his presence more acutely, the sound of his voice as he spoke with the other ranch hands, the way he always seemed to be the first to offer help when a task was difficult, the gentle way he handled the horses, and the young calves born as winter gave way to early spring. Sometimes she would glance up from her work to find him watching her, his expression thoughtful, before he would quickly look away. Other times, he would seek her out specifically, asking her opinion on some matter related to the ranch or sharing an observation about the changing season. Alina noticed, of course. "Xavier seems to have taken quite an interest in your thoughts on cattle breeding," she remarked one afternoon as they prepared dinner, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Rosalind felt her cheeks grow warm. "He's just being polite." Alina hummed skeptically. "The same way he's just being polite when he makes sure to fill your coffee cup first at breakfast, or when he happened to fix that loose floorboard in the hallway outside your room, or when he carved that beautiful wooden box he gave you last week." "That was a thank you gift," Rosalind protested. "For helping with the ledgers when Mr. Hollister was ill." "Of course it was," Alina agreed, her expression innocent. "Just as the wildflowers he brought back from his ride yesterday were simply because he thought they would brighten up the kitchen." Rosalind couldn't help but smile. The small bunch of early spring flowers now sat in a jar on the windowsill of her bedroom, where she could see them first thing each morning. "You're imagining things, Alina." "Am I?" Alina challenged gently. "Because from where I stand, it seems that Xavier Evans has developed feelings for you, Rosalind. And I suspect you might feel something for him as well." The directness of the statement caught Rosalind off guard. Did she have feelings for Xavier? The question had been hovering at the edges of her consciousness for weeks, but she had pushed it aside, unwilling to examine it too closely. Thomas had only been gone for 6 months. Was it even possible to develop feelings for another man so soon? "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Thomas and we were everything to each other. I never imagined there could be anyone else." Alina's expression softened. "Love isn't a limited resource, Rosalind. Caring for Xavier doesn't diminish what you had with Thomas. Even so, it feels disloyal somehow." "Would Thomas want you to be alone?" Alina asked quietly. "Or would he want you to find happiness again, even if it wasn't with him?" The question echoed Rosalind's own thoughts from the day she had visited her homestead with Xavier. Thomas had always wanted her happiness above all else. He had encouraged her to form friendships in their isolated community, knowing how much she valued connection. Would he truly want her to shut herself off from the possibility of love again? "I don't know if what I feel for Xavier is love," Rosalind said slowly, "but I do care for him. More than I expected to." Alina squeezed her hand. "That's a start. The rest will come in its own time if it's meant to." The conversation stayed with Rosalind throughout the evening, making her acutely aware of Xavier's presence at the dinner table, of the way his eyes sought hers when someone said something amusing, of the quiet good night he directed specifically to her as the ranch hands filed out to the bunkhouse. That night, as she lay in bed watching the moonlight create patterns on her ceiling, Rosalind allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she had planned with Thomas. Not a replacement for what she had lost, but something new, unexpected, yet full of possibility. The next morning dawned clear and mild, one of the first truly spring-like days they had experienced. Rosalind woke early, drawn outside by the promise of sunshine and warmer temperatures. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch, breathing deeply of the fresh air. To her surprise, Xavier was already outside, chopping wood near the barn. His sleeves were rolled up despite the morning chill, and he worked with steady, powerful strokes that split each log cleanly. Rosalind watched him for a moment, appreciating the fluid strength of his movements. As if sensing her presence, Xavier looked up, his axe pausing mid-swing. "Good morning," he called, setting the tool aside and walking toward the porch. "You're up early." "It's too beautiful a day to waste in bed," Rosalind replied, smiling. "Spring is finally here, I think." Xavier nodded, looking around at the mountains where patches of green were beginning to appear among the snow. "Another couple of weeks and the trails will be clear enough for regular travel." He hesitated. "Will you still want to return to your homestead then?" The question hung between them, heavier than its simple words suggested. Rosalind thought of her conversation with Alina, of the growing warmth she felt whenever Xavier was near, of the charred remains of her cabin standing lonely on the ridge. "I've been thinking about that," she said carefully. My original plan was to rebuild, to continue the life Thomas and I started there. But now," she paused, gathering her courage, "now I'm not so certain that's the right path." Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, hope perhaps, or relief. "The Hollisters would be glad to have you stay on permanently," he said. "They've come to rely on you." "And you?" Rosalind asked, her heart beating faster. "Would you be glad if I stayed?" Xavier took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. "More than glad," he said quietly. "These past months, watching you rebuild your life after such loss, seeing your strength and determination, I've come to admire you greatly, Rosalind." The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. "I've come to admire you as well, Xavier." He smiled, a rare full smile that transformed his usually serious face. "I've been building a house," he said, the words coming in a rush as if he had held them back for too long. "On my land, about 2 miles from here. It's nearly finished now, a proper house with 4 rooms and a stone fireplace. I've been working on it evenings and days off for almost 2 years. Rosalind was surprised. "Eleanor mentioned you had land, but I didn't realize you were building on it. I've been saving for years, planning for the future." Xavier's eyes held her steadily. "For a family someday." The implication was clear, and Rosalind felt both thrilled and uncertain. "Xavier, I'm not asking for anything now," he interrupted gently. "I know it's too soon, that you're still healing. I just wanted you to know that if you decide to stay in this valley, there are possibilities for both of us when you're ready." The offer was so respectful of her grief, so understanding of her need for time, that Rosalind felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Xavier nodded, taking a small step back as if to give her space. "Would you like to see it someday?" "The house? I would," she replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "Very much." Before either of them could say more, the ranch house door opened and Eleanor stepped out, calling them in for breakfast. The moment was broken, but something had shifted between them. A door opened to a future neither had fully acknowledged until now. 2 weeks later, on a warm Sunday afternoon, Xavier took Rosalind to see his house. They rode side by side across rolling grassland, where wildflowers were beginning to bloom, through a small stand of pines, and finally up a gentle slope that overlooked a clear, fast-flowing creek. The house stood on the crest of the hill, solid and welcoming with its fresh-cut timber walls and stone chimney. It wasn't large, but it was well built, with careful attention to detail evident in the even spacing of the windows, the sturdy porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and the decorative carvings on the porch posts. "Xavier, it's beautiful," Rosalind breathed as they dismounted. He smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "It's not finished inside yet, but I wanted to build something that would last, something solid." He showed her through the rooms a large main living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with shelves he had crafted himself, 2 bedrooms, and a small study. The interior walls were up but not yet finished, and the floors were rough-hewn planks that would eventually be sanded smooth. "I thought this could be a sitting room," Xavier said, gesturing to the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. "Or a nursery someday." The casual mention of children made Rosalind's heart skip a beat. She had dreamed of having a family with Thomas, a dream that had died with him. The possibility of that dream being reborn, of building a new family with a different man, was both frightening and exhilarating. "It's perfect for either," she said softly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Xavier led her back outside to the porch, where he had set up 2 chairs facing the view of the mountains. From here, they could see for miles the creek winding through the valley, the distant peaks still capped with snow, and the rich grassland that would be perfect for grazing cattle. "I have 60 head of cattle and 15 horses," Xavier said as they sat down. "Not a large herd yet, but growing. The creek provides water year-round, and there's good shelter in the pine grove for the winter months." He paused. "It's a good place to build a life." Rosalind nodded, understanding that he was sharing not just the practical aspects of the ranch, but also his dreams for its future. How long have you owned this land? 5 years, Xavier replied. I bought it when I first came to work for the Hollisters. It was just empty grassland then, but I could see what it could become. He glanced at her. That first day when I rode to your homestead after the fire, I was on my way back from here. I'd been checking on things, making plans for the spring building. You've worked hard, Rosalind said, noting the calluses on his hands, the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the sun. I wanted something of my own, he said simply, something no one could take away. There was a story there, Rosalind thought, something from his past that had taught him the value of security and independence. But she didn't press. If Xavier wanted to share that part of himself, he would do so in his own time. They stayed until the sun began to set, talking easily about the land, the house, their childhoods in the east before they had each made their way west. Xavier spoke of his plans for expanding the herd, for adding a proper barn and corrals, for planting an orchard on the south-facing slope below the house. As dusk approached, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the ride back to the Hollister ranch. Just before they left, Xavier turned to Rosalind. What do you think? Of the place, I mean. There was vulnerability in the question that touched Rosalind deeply. I think it's wonderful, Xavier, a perfect place to build a future. His smile was like the sunrise breaking slowly across his face. That's what I hoped you'd say. Over the next month, spring fully established itself in the valley. The snow melted from all but the highest peaks, the grass grew lush and green, and the ranch became a hive of activity as the cattle were moved to summer pastures and new calves were branded. Rosalind had officially accepted the Hollisters' offer of permanent employment, putting aside her plans to return to her homestead. She still rode out occasionally to check on the property, sometimes alone and sometimes with Xavier, but each visit reinforced her decision. The land held memories, but it was no longer home. Her relationship with Xavier continued to develop carefully and respectfully. They found moments to spend together amidst their busy days, early morning walks before the work began, shared meals at the long table where their hands would occasionally brush, evening conversations on the porch as the stars emerged above the mountains. On a particularly beautiful evening in late May, Xavier asked Rosalind to ride with him after supper. They followed the creek that ran near the ranch, the water high with snowmelt, until they reached a small meadow filled with wildflowers. Xavier spread a blanket on the ground, and they sat side by side, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the mountains gold and crimson. The air was sweet with the scent of grass and flowers, and somewhere nearby a meadowlark sang its evening song. I spoke with Mr. Hollister today, Xavier said after a comfortable silence. I've given notice at the ranch. I'll be moving to my own place at the end of the month to work it full time. Rosalind felt a twinge of sadness at the thought of not seeing him every day. That's wonderful, Xavier. I know how much you've wanted to focus on building your own ranch. He nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. The house is finished now, all it needs is furniture and… He turned to look at her, his expression serious, and a family to make it a home. Rosalind's heart beat faster. Xavier, I know it's only been 7 months since you lost Thomas, he continued quietly. And I would never presume to replace him in your heart, but I've come to care for you deeply, Rosalind, more than I thought possible. Tears pricked at Rosalind's eyes. I care for you too, she whispered. Xavier took her hand, his touch gentle. I'm not asking for an answer now, I'm just asking you to think about our future together, about building something new, something that honors what you had with Thomas but isn't defined by it. The words resonated deeply with Rosalind. Over the past months, she had gradually come to understand that loving Xavier didn't diminish what she had shared with Thomas. It was different, grown from different soil, but no less real or valuable. I don't need to think about it, she said, surprising herself with her certainty. My heart already knows the answer. Xavier's eyes widened, hope and caution warring in his expression. And what does your heart say? That life is too precious and too unpredictable to waste, Rosalind said softly, "that Thomas would want me to be happy to love again. And that what I feel for you is real and true and worth building a future on." With gentle reverence, Xavier cupped her face in his hands. "May I kiss you, Rosalind Lockhart?" "Yes," she breathed, and his lips met hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey, familiar and new all at once, filled with promise and possibility. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since that first day when you stood in the ashes of your cabin and refused to be defeated." Rosalind smiled through her tears. "I love you too, Xavier Evans, more than I thought I could love again." They were married on a perfect summer day in early July, in a small ceremony at Xavier's, now their house on the hill. Eleanor Hollister, now the mother of a healthy baby boy, stood as Rosalind's witness, while Mr. Hollister stood for Xavier. The local minister performed the service on the front porch, with the mountains as a backdrop and wildflowers decorating every surface. Rosalind wore a new dress of pale blue that Eleanor had helped her make, with a crown of wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Xavier, usually seen in work clothes, wore a clean white shirt and black trousers, his dark hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. When they spoke their vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all the joys and hardships that frontier life might bring, there wasn't a dry eye among their small gathering of friends and neighbors. That evening, after their guests had departed and they were alone in their home for the first time as husband and wife, Xavier led Rosalind to the fireplace where a small fire warded off the evening chill. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a package wrapped in soft cloth from a shelf. Rosalind unwrapped it carefully to reveal a carved wooden box, similar to but more elaborate than the one he had given her months ago. This one was decorated with intricate patterns of wildflowers and mountains, the craftsmanship exquisite. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the detailed carving. "Open it," Xavier encouraged softly. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a silver locket on a delicate chain. Rosalind lifted it with trembling fingers and opened it to find a tiny portrait of Thomas on one side, a copy of the photograph she had salvaged from the fire, and a small lock of Xavier's dark hair on the other. "So you can keep both of us close to your heart," Xavier explained. "Your past and your future." Tears filled Rosalind's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift, at this man's understanding and acceptance of the love she still carried for Thomas. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find adequate words for what the gesture meant to her. Xavier fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. "Your heart is big enough for both of us," he said, "and I'm honored to share it." In that moment, standing in the warm light of their hearth, Rosalind felt a sense of completion she had not thought possible after the devastating losses she had endured. Life had taken her on an unexpected journey, from the ashes of her old cabin to this new beginning with a man whose quiet strength and compassion had rebuilt not just her shelter but her heart. As she looked up at Xavier, at the love shining in his blue eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. Not replacing what was lost, but building something new and beautiful from the foundations of all that had come before. "I love you, Xavier Evans," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Thank you for bringing me home." "I love you, Rosalind Evans," he replied, his arms encircling her waist. "Thank you for making this house a home." Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, a new family began, built on love and respect, on shared dreams and mutual understanding. And in the years that followed, as their ranch flourished and their family grew, Rosalind and Xavier never forgot how their story began with a widow in the ashes of her cabin, a cowboy who brought her wood, and the future they built together, one day at a time, in the untamed heart of the American West. The Evans Ranch grew steadily over the years, becoming one of the most prosperous in the valley. Xavier's careful management and Rosalind's practical efficiency proved to be a powerful combination, allowing them to weather the unpredictable challenges of frontier life with resilience and determination. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Xavier's mother, was born the spring after their marriage. She arrived during a late-season snowstorm that nearly prevented the doctor from reaching them in time, but Xavier rode through the blizzard to fetch him, refusing to leave Rosalind to face childbirth alone. Elizabeth was a bright, curious child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair. From an early age, she showed a love for books and stories that reminded Rosalind of Thomas, a connection that brought comfort rather than pain as the years passed. 2 years later, their son Thomas Xavier was born, named for the two men who had shaped Rosalind's life in such profound ways. A sturdy, serious baby, he grew into a thoughtful boy who shadowed his father's every move, learning the ways of the ranch with quiet determination. Their family was completed 3 years after that with the arrival of twins James and Margaret, whose boundless energy and mischievous natures kept the household lively and full of laughter. Through the years of child-rearing and ranch building, Rosalind and Xavier maintained the deep connection that had grown between them during those first months after the fire. They worked as true partners, each respecting the other's strengths and supporting each other through the inevitable hardships that frontier life brought. There were difficult years, seasons of drought that threatened the cattle, harsh winters that tested their endurance, and the constant challenges of raising 4 children in a place where medical care was scarce and formal education often had to be provided at home. But there were also countless moments of joy and beauty. Family picnics in the wildflower meadow where Xavier had first declared his love. Evenings spent around the fireplace with Xavier teaching the children to carve wood while Rosalind read aloud from beloved books. The satisfaction of watching their herd grow and their orchards bear fruit. The deep contentment of falling asleep in each other's arms after a day of shared work and purpose. Rosalind never rebuilt on her original homestead. Instead, she and Xavier would ride out there several times a year, bringing the children as they grew old enough to make the journey. They planted wildflowers where the cabin had stood and maintained the small wooden cross that marked Thomas's grave beneath the cottonwood tree. "This is where your mother's first husband is buried," Xavier explained to the children when they were old enough to understand. "He was a good man who loved her very much, and without him, she might never have come west, and I might never have found her." It was this honesty and respect for the past that strengthened the bond between Rosalind and Xavier, creating a marriage built on complete trust and understanding. Xavier never felt threatened by Thomas's memory, and Rosalind never felt she had to hide her continued affection for her first husband. As the children grew, the Evans Ranch became known throughout the territory not only for its fine cattle and horses, but also for its hospitality. Travelers passing through could count on a hot meal and a warm welcome, and neighboring ranchers often sought Xavier's advice on everything from breeding stock to water management. Rosalind, drawing on her experience helping Eleanor Hollister, became something of a midwife for the scattered women of the valley, riding out in all weather when called upon, bringing her practical skills and compassionate presence to many difficult births. By the time Elizabeth was 16, the valley had changed considerably. The railroad had come through, bringing more settlers and transforming the once isolated community into a growing town. The Evans children attended the newly built schoolhouse during the winter months, though their education was still supplemented at home, with Xavier teaching mathematics and ranch management while Rosalind handled literature, history, and the practical domestic arts. Through all the changes, the house on the hill remained the heart of their world. Xavier had expanded it over the years, adding rooms as their family grew and improving the outbuildings as the ranch prospered. But he was careful to preserve the original structure, the home he had built with his own hands during those years of hoping and planning for a family of his own. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Rosalind with a special gift. While she was visiting Eleanor Hollister for the day, he and the children completed a project they had been working on in secret for months, a glass-enclosed porch on the east side of the house, filled with comfortable chairs and shelves for the books Rosalind loved, a place where she could enjoy the morning sunlight year-round. "For all the sunrises we've shared," he told her as he led her, blindfolded, to the new addition, "and for all those still to come." When she removed the blindfold and saw the beautiful space, Rosalind was overcome with emotion. It was exactly what she would have designed for herself, practical yet beautiful, connecting the inside of their home with the landscape she had grown to love so deeply. "It's perfect," she whispered, taking in the view of the mountains through the glass walls. "Just perfect." "Like you," Xavier said, his voice still holding the same warmth and admiration it had 20 years earlier when he had first told her he loved her. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, the older ones to their rooms in the house, the twins to the separate cabin Xavier had built for them when they turned 13, Rosalind and Xavier sat together on the new porch, watching the stars emerge above the mountains. "Did you ever imagine this?" Rosalind asked, her head resting on Xavier's shoulder, her hand in his. "When you were building this house alone, did you see all of this in your future?" Xavier was quiet for a moment, considering. "I hoped," he finally said. "I hoped for a family, for children, for a partner to share it all with. But the reality, you, our children, the life we've built together has been far better than anything I could have imagined." Rosalind squeezed his hand. "Even with all the hardships. The drought years, the times we nearly lost the north pasture to fire, the winter James had pneumonia and we thought we might lose him. Even with all of that," Xavier confirmed, "because we faced it together, and because the joy has always outweighed the hardship." He turned to look at her, his face lined now with 2 decades of sun and weather and laughter, but his eyes still the same clear blue that had first caught her attention all those years ago. "What about you? When you were kneeling in the ashes of your cabin, did you ever imagine finding happiness again?" "Never," Rosalind admitted. "I thought my life was over, that all I could hope for was survival, not joy." She smiled, touching the silver locket she still wore every day, the one that held Thomas's image on one side and a lock of Xavier's hair on the other. "I was so focused on what I had lost that I couldn't see what might still be found." Xavier kissed her gently. "And now I understand that life is full of endings and beginnings, and sometimes they happen simultaneously." She looked out at the ranch, at the home they had built together. "The fire that destroyed my cabin with Thomas led me to you, to our children, to this life that I cherish so deeply." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the connection between them so strong after 20 years that words were often unnecessary. Finally, Xavier spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I received a letter from James Hollister today," he said, referring to Eleanor and Edward's son, now a grown man running his parents' ranch. "He's thinking of selling some of his northern acreage, says it's too much for him to manage with his father's health failing. He offered us first chance to buy it." Rosalind considered this. The Hollister land to the north of their property had excellent water access and would allow them to expand their herd significantly. "What do you think? Can we afford it?" "With the prices cattle are bringing these days, and if we take out a small loan, yes," Xavier said, "but it would mean more work, more responsibility." "The children could help," Rosalind suggested. "Elizabeth will be returning from her schooling in Denver soon, and Thomas is already as capable as any ranch hand. Even the twins are old enough to take on more responsibility." Xavier nodded. "I was thinking the same. And with the railroad making it easier to get cattle to market, the timing might be right for expansion." He paused. "But I wanted to be sure you were in agreement. This is a decision we should make together." Rosalind felt a surge of love for this man who, even after 20 years of marriage, still valued her opinion on every important matter. It had been this equal partnership, this deep respect that had formed the foundation of their enduring bond. "I think we should do it," she said decisively. "Build something even stronger to pass on to our children." Xavier smiled, the same slow, sunrise smile that still made her heart beat faster. "Then we will." As they sat together planning their future, Rosalind reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. From the devastating loss of her first husband and home to the unexpected joy of a second chance at love and family, her life had taken turns she could never have predicted. Yet somehow, through all the twists and turns, she had found her way to this house on the hill, to this man whose strength and tenderness had rebuilt not just her shelter but her heart, to these children who carried forward the best of all those who had loved them. From the ashes of her cabin, a new and beautiful life had emerged, one filled with love and purpose, with challenges overcome and dreams fulfilled, with a future still unfolding before them like the vast Montana sky, limitless and full of promise. And as the stars shimmered overhead and the distant howl of a wolf echoed across the valley, Rosalind Evans, no longer a widow but a wife, mother, and cornerstone of a thriving ranch, knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, home in every sense of the word, with the family that fate and choice had given her. Xavier reached over and tucked a strand of hair, now streaked with silver, behind her ear. "What are you thinking about with that smile on your face?" "About how endings can become beginnings," she replied, leaning into his touch. "And about how grateful I am that you brought me wood that day, and with it, a future I never dared to imagine." "I'm the grateful one," Xavier said softly. "Every single day." As they sat together in the home they had built, surrounded by the fruits of 20 years of shared labor and love, the fire that had once destroyed Rosalind's world seemed not an ending but a beginning, the first spark of a new life that had grown into something more beautiful and enduring than either of them could have ever dreamed possible.